Have you ever imagined being able to fool entire systems? To show the world a face that's not even yours, living a life full of adventure and challenges, while everyone thinks you're someone else? Well, today, we're taking you on a journey through time to meet a person who might just be the most thrilling and mysterious figure of his era. This wasn't your average con artist, this was a mind like no other. Someone who could manipulate everything around him. From banks to airlines, from medicine to law. He came up with new ways every single day to make the systems fall at his feet. But the real question is, could he escape his fate in the end? Before we dive into the crazy details of his story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit that notification bell. And don't forget to drop a like if you're excited to hear the full tale. Because trust me, this story, full of deception, brilliance, and excitement, is one you won't want to miss. So who is this person who flipped all the roles upside down? Let's find out now. Frank William Abagnale Jr. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born on April 27, 1948, in the Queens neighborhood of New York City, into a middle-class family. His father, Frank Abagnale Sr., was an ambitious businessman, quickly rising in the world of trade. He was driven by the need to achieve big success in society, obsessed with presenting himself as the perfect image of a successful man in the eyes of others. He placed all his bets on financial power and material things as a way to prove his social standing. His mother, Barbara Abagnale, was a strong-willed and pragmatic woman who played a pivotal role in raising her children with a strict hand. But despite his father's lofty ambitions, life at home was anything but easy. Tensions between his parents were always simmering beneath the surface. His father struggled with significant financial problems, while his mother felt an ever-present pressure to provide psychological stability for the kids. Even at a young age, Frank showed an uncanny ability to notice the cracks in the foundation of his family. But he couldn't yet fully understand what was going on. His relationship with his parents was fraught with tension, and there was this emotional chasm that kept him feeling disconnected from them. Then, in 1959, when Frank was just 11, his parents' marriage finally fell apart after years of continuous arguments. The divorce became a seismic shift in his life. It hit him like a gut punch. Confusion, betrayal, and chaos took over his world. For the first time, Frank started losing trust in the idea of a perfect family, the ones that seemed stable and happy on the outside. And in the middle of all this emotional turmoil, he made a terrifying realization: the adults, those people he once saw as the pillars of trust and strength, could crumble too. After the divorce, Frank bounced between living with his mom and then his dad, only to go back to his mom again. This constant moving around was more than just physical, it was a deep emotional split, leaving him feeling lost. He was stuck in the middle of a battle between the people who couldn't even keep their own relationship together. And all he wanted was a place where he could finally feel at peace, feel safe. His dad, struggling with serious financial issues after the divorce, constantly tried to prove his worth by buying fancy things, showing off his luxurious life. But over time, the debt piled up, and his ability to rebuild his career slipped further and further out of reach. That failure ate away at him, and it showed. It was hard to ignore how his frustration bled into his relationship with Frank. His mom, on the other hand, focused more on trying to provide emotional stability for him. But she didn't always know how to do it. She had this constant worry about Frank's future. And even though she did her best to make sure he had some stability, she couldn't offer him the deep emotional support he needed. As Frank grew older, he started feeling more and more isolated. He couldn't trust the world around him anymore, his family, society. Everything felt like it was falling apart. He saw relationships as fragile, fleeting, and it became harder for him to believe in anything real. This was when he started to show signs of rebelling against everything: society's rules, its expectations, its moral codes. He thought life was nothing more than a series of fake faces, that everyone was pretending to be something they weren't. Living in this whirlwind of emotional chaos, Frank started to retreat even further. Instead of facing his emotions, he began to find ways to escape the reality that trapped him. Life became a blur of confusion, a place where loss pulled him deeper into uncertainty. He started to feel like the world wasn't something you could trust, that you had to play the game in order to get anything out of it. Life, as he discovered, didn't give anything away for free. During this time of emotional turbulence, Frank began to build a new persona, one that was fractured, broken. He started avoiding the normal life he was supposed to have at his age. Instead, He created new identities, living through them, trying them on like new clothes. Every time he switched, it felt like he was trying to find out who he really was. But it wasn't easy. He felt stuck, trapped in a world that didn't give him the answers he was desperately searching for. His teenage years were a blur of escaping reality. Frank became known for his ability to manipulate everything around him. He would spend hours mimicking others signing documents with fake signatures, or copying their behaviors just to feel like he was part of a world he couldn't quite fit into. He found satisfaction in the fact that, with a quick shift, he could become anyone. In the midst of the emotional chaos he was going through, Frank began searching for a way to feel powerful, to feel in control. His view of the world shifted completely. He no longer saw authority or structure as something to trust, but as tools to be used for his own gain. He realized that success and power weren't about hard work, they could be achieved through cunning and intelligence. This revelation marked the beginning of the path he would take in the future. The deep feelings of isolation and weakness from his childhood shaped the way he thought moving forward. Those moments of vulnerability became the fuel that later drove him into the world of fraud. He began to believe that life wasn't for those who played by the rules, but for the ones who were smart enough to outwit the system. The world was a game, and only the cleverest and most deceitful would win. By 1964, Frank was just 17. This was the start of his journey into crime, and at this point, he became obsessed with finding a way to make quick money without putting in any real effort. The feelings of frustration and isolation born from the divorce and family pressures pushed him further into this search for an escape from his life. And what better way to do that than by targeting the small banks of New York? At first, Frank started by practicing how to mimic signatures. His skill at it was flawless, an ability that would become one of his most important tools. Moving forward, he began forging his own checks, using the fake signatures to pull money from the banks. At this point, Frank realized that the small banks, which didn't have complex security systems, were the perfect targets for cons like him. These banks relied on simple procedures for verifying checks, and didn't do a thorough check of all the details. The small amounts he was stealing slipped through, without raising any suspicions. Slowly, the checks started increasing in value from $200 to $1,000. These amounts were enough to give him a more luxurious life, the kind he had always dreamed of. Frank first targeted checks that still had old account numbers, or those that weren't tied to active accounts. He'd alter the dates and amounts written on these old checks, using an old typewriter to add the new details after changing the original info. He even used paper that looked almost identical to the kind checks were printed on, making it seem like it was the real deal. With these techniques, Frank was able to pass off his fake checks at several different banks. He changed signatures and dates in such a way that the checks looked like they came from real, active accounts. It wasn't just about forging signatures, he also started creating fake IDs to convince bank employees that he was legit. One of the most famous stories from this time was when he set his sights on the New York Trust Bank. By this point, Frank was skilled at forgery, and he decided to target this particular bank, which, at the time, was a small operation without advanced security measures to check the validity of checks. Frank used forged paperwork and fake bank statements to pass off a check for $3,000. The amounts he'd been cashing up until then were relatively small, but this time, he decided to up the ante, making the amount large enough to draw more attention. Standing confidently in front of the bank employee, Frank flashed a fake ID with a made-up name while holding the forged check. The operation went off without a hitch, and he walked away with the cash, undetected. But he wasn't about to go back to this bank after pulling off such a big job. Instead, he moved on to other banks, expanding his fraudulent operations even further. As time passed, Frank began thinking about the bigger challenge, targeting the major banks. By 1965, after learning from his experiences with smaller banks, he set his sights on Citibank, one of the largest banks in New York at the time. Even though these bigger banks had more advanced security systems compared to the smaller ones, Frank knew how to adapt and manipulate those systems to his advantage. He walked into Citibank with a completely new persona, now carrying a forged identity with a fabricated history and fake accounts. Cracking into these bigger banks with larger sums of money became a real challenge for him. Frank prepared for this job with extreme precision. He picked the right time, the exact moment when the bank employees were busy with routine tasks, so no one would be paying close attention. At times, when the bank employees were swamped with routine transactions, they didn't have the time to fully check the details of each customer. One day, Frank deposited a forged check for $5 into one of his fake accounts and requested to withdraw the cash. The check cleared without a hitch, and after he walked away with the money, he left the bank without leaving a single trace behind. It was a huge win for him, proof that he could crack even more sophisticated systems. These small victories only boosted his confidence, driving him to keep going with his fraudulent schemes. At this point, Frank wasn't just sticking to one or two banks. He started hopping between different banks in New York. He knew how to pick the ones with looser security, and he always kept an eye on the staff, timing his moves when the banks were least busy. He'd slip through unnoticed, making sure to switch up his methods each time so he wouldn't get caught. He even started building a network of people who helped him gather intel on banks or potential targets he could scam. He had a group of people feeding him account details or helping him launder the money after he'd taken it. With every successful con, his trust in himself grew, and so did his belief that he was untouchable. But while he was succeeding at these smaller scams, Frank started to feel like the old tricks wouldn't be enough anymore. So, he began developing new methods. For instance, he mastered the art of forging invoices to buy goods at low prices and resell them at higher rates, effectively making money in a more indirect way. He quickly learned that fraud wasn't just about forging checks. It could be expanded into even more complicated schemes, which proved crucial as his operations grew. Over time, the cons Frank was pulling off got bigger and more intricate. As he passed more forged checks and fooled more bank employees, his ambition started growing. But with every success, he also felt the clock ticking, and deep down, he knew this couldn't last forever. At the same time, the authorities were beginning to close in on him. The FBI was starting to track multiple cases of bank fraud, and they noticed a pattern emerging. With the risks increasing, Frank kept manipulating the banking system, jumping from one bank to another, still managing to pull off small wins thanks to his quick wit and his well-thought-out escape strategies. Between 1964 and 1965, Frank Abagnale pulled off some mind-blowing cons, outsmarting the banking system in ways that seemed almost impossible. He exploited human errors with incredible precision and developed innovative methods that made it tough for anyone to catch on. But deep down, he knew these operations couldn't last forever. With every job he pulled, the danger grew, and he understood that every new con brought him closer to being exposed. By the time Frank turned 17 and honed his skills in forgery and scamming banks, he started to feel like this type of crime was no longer enough of a challenge for him. He was always looking for new, more thrilling, and complex adventures where he could test his ability to deceive and manipulate in new ways. So, driven by his thirst for more, Frank decided to move to the next level in his criminal career. He would assume the identity of a pilot. By the end of 1965, Frank had become a master forger with tons of experience creating fake documents and inventing new identities. He knew that if he was going to pull this off, he needed something more sophisticated, something nearly impossible to detect. The idea of impersonating a pilot came to him when he realized that airline pilots had incredible perks, like free travel around the world and stays in luxury hotels. It was the perfect opportunity for him to escape the monotony of his life. Pan Am, one of the largest airlines at the time, offered pilots benefits that included free tickets and the ability to travel to distant places. So, Frank saw his shot. But how was he going to crack this system? He didn't know anything about flying or planes, but what he did know was how to manipulate the system. He started researching everything there was to know about how pilots were hired by airlines. He studied the workflow inside the airline, learning exactly how pilots were tested and trained. He began looking into how he could get his hands on forged IDs that would pass as a pilot's, fake ID cards, training certificates, everything he would need to pull this off. He knew success required careful planning and a methodical approach. With his skills in forgery, Frank started replicating the documents needed to impersonate a pilot. He created a fully forged pilot's training certificate, one of the most critical documents in pulling off this scam. He understood that these fake documents had to be flawless down to the smallest detail. He altered dates, stamped fake seals, and attached forged flight certificates to make them look entirely authentic. Frank used his creative skills to come up with a masterful technique for forging signatures and credentials. He had his own special method for copying signatures from airline employees, and even mimicking the intricate lines of official stamps. Once Frank felt his forged documents were ready, he decided to take the leap. He didn't have a real pilot's license, but he carried a fake one that claimed he had graduated from a prestigious U.S. flight academy. He went ahead and began impersonating a pilot at Pan Am. Carefully crafting his approach, he walked into one of the airline's administrative offices and started talking to the employees, handling recruitment, telling them he was a recent graduate looking for a job. It was almost too easy for him to convince them. They overlooked any internal checks because his forged papers were convincing enough. He was given an official ID that allowed him to travel as a free-ride pilot under the airline system for employees. But Frank didn't stop there. Instead of just settling for these perks, he pushed his manipulation even further. Frank's adventure in the sky began out of nowhere. After getting the right uniform that matched Pan Am's standards, he decided to take his first flight. He had zero training in flying, but as usual, he trusted his ability to outsmart any situation. He positioned himself in places with the least amount of scrutiny. During flights, Frank claimed to be in training, which meant he didn't have to do anything related to actually flying the plane. But that didn't stop him from watching the other pilots and showing enough interest to appear like he knew what he was doing. He stayed calm and alert to the systems on the plane, learning from the experienced pilots who thought he was just a rookie. He was a pro at how to act like a real pilot. He walked through the planes with confidence, spoke the pilot's language, and no one questioned him. In one situation, he even managed to fly from New York to New Orleans on a Pan Am flight, using his skill at blending in with the staff, casually asking for food and drinks in the pilot lounges. Once Frank successfully made his way through these early flights, he realized that the benefits of flying could be huge. Pan Am gave pilots free travel perks, meaning he could fly anywhere in the world without paying a dime. Frank started taking full advantage of these perks, traveling to places like Paris, Tokyo, and Munich. These trips gave him the chance to stay in luxury hotels, eat and drink for free. In fact, his lifestyle started to look like that of a real pilot, but the truth was, he was just a fake. In one instance, he realized he could use his fake status as a pilot to avoid the high cost of hotels. He'd introduce himself as a pilot returning from a long flight, and usually, he was treated exceptionally well at top hotels worldwide. They'd give him luxury accommodations in the pilot's rooms, often at no cost or at a reduced rate. One of the most intense moments during this time happened while Frank was on a transatlantic flight. The crew started noticing some strange behaviors from him. For example, he avoided answering questions about aviation, and he tended to speak in a non-professional way about technical aspects of the plane. A younger pilot began watching him closely, asking him questions about his flying background. But thanks to his fake credentials, Frank expertly dodged the suspicions and kept the conversation moving. However, during one of his long flights across the Atlantic, the crew started growing more suspicious, especially when an older pilot asked him to confirm some technical details about the plane. Frank flashed a brilliant smile and gave vague, indirect answers, but the investigators were closing in. It was only a matter of time before they uncovered his lie, so Frank decided to change his plan. In a defining moment, Frank chose to leave the plane during a layover in a European station and escape before they could catch him. He seized the opportunity, boarded another flight heading in the opposite direction, and eventually made his way back to New York. His fake identity wasn't uncovered during that trip, but it was a reminder that manipulating the system could be a dangerous game. From there, Frank kept pushing his luck, booking flights to different destinations, continuing to exploit his pilot's card. He moved back and forth between the US and Europe, traveling on planes that allowed him unlimited flights, with no one ever suspecting he wasn't a real pilot. From 1965 to 1967, Frank had perfected a stealthy infiltration into the airline system. The true reward for him was the free travel. The temptations were huge, living between the sky and the earth, hopping from country to country, escaping the life he had known. He began to feel like this was the true kind of freedom. But deep down, he knew this wild ride couldn't last forever. Even though he was living the dream, he also knew that one day it would all come crashing down. Still, he couldn't resist continuing to exploit the system, planning even bigger and bolder ways to manipulate other systems in the future. Frank's adventures as a fake pilot didn't last long, though. Investigations into fraud and airline infiltrations were beginning to surface. But from 1965 to 1967, he had created an alternate world for himself, a world full of free travel, luxurious hotels, and unforgettable adventures. He had soared through the sky without wings of his own, living a life that few could ever imagine. After Frank Abagnale had successfully impersonated a pilot and mastered manipulating large systems like airlines, he started to feel like his previous adventures were starting to unravel. He needed a new challenge. Frank wasn't just looking to escape everyday life or grab more material perks. He was looking to test how far he could push his ability to manipulate more complex and dangerous systems. So, he moved on to the next phase of his criminal life, impersonating a doctor. The idea of becoming a doctor didn't come out of nowhere. It stemmed from Frank's deep curiosity about how the medical system worked, and his fascination with deception and persuasion. After years of successful cons, Frank realized that the medical profession was the perfect challenge for him. He knew that being a doctor gave you vast authority control within hospitals, dealing with people's lives, and the potential to land a prestigious position. He noticed that doctors were highly respected and held a position of power in society. People placed blind trust in anyone wearing a white coat. This was the key element that drew his attention, how something as pure and trusted as medicine could be used as a tool for deception. Even though he understood the gravity of this role, he believed he could manipulate the medical system just as he had manipulated the banks and airlines. The first step in becoming a fake doctor involved deep research into how doctors obtained their credentials and the systems governing the medical profession. Frank started reading up on medical schools, training programs, and even the licensing requirements in the U.S. It took a lot of time, but he was determined. He learned the fine details about medical education in the United States. He discovered that there was no absolute need to have a real medical degree to become a medical assistant. You could fake your way through by posing as someone in training, or even someone switching to a limited medical position. He also realized that hospitals didn't always verify the specifics of an assistant's qualifications, which gave him the opening he needed to create a foolproof plan to forge the documents. Using his previous experience in forgery, Frank began crafting a fake medical degree from a prestigious medical school. He created a fake medical studies certificate. These forged documents looked so real that anyone who saw them would be convinced they were genuine. He carefully forged dates and added flawless details, avoiding any mistakes that could expose him. He also forged signatures from top medical professionals to make the documents even more believable. Frank created a fake resume that showed he'd worked in well-known hospitals, with fabricated details explaining his role as a medical assistant. The documents were so perfect that anyone who saw them would immediately assume they were real. In 1967, Frank decided to put his plan into action. He went to St. Mary's Hospital in Louisiana, where there was little scrutiny of new medical paperwork. Instead of entering as a patient, Frank decided to sneak in as a medical assistant. Armed with his forged credentials, he walked into the hospital and claimed he was a new hire, transferred from another hospital. Using his charm and medical knowledge, he quickly convinced the hospital staff that he was a seasoned medical assistant. This was just the beginning. Frank was assigned routine tasks at the hospital, like conducting initial patient exams, monitoring health conditions, and writing prescriptions based on the orders of the senior doctors. All he had to do was carry out simple medical checks and provide reports he had written himself, where his forged signature and fake expertise were always respected. Even though he didn't know anything real about medicine, his confident appearance and way of speaking about medical exams convinced everyone that he was a real doctor. As time went on, Frank moved between different hospitals across the U.S., using the same forged documents, jumping from Louisiana to New York, where he tried to deceive medical staff again. At the New York hospital, he used his alias once more and presented forged documents that claimed he had graduated from a prestigious medical school. He continued his deception for several months, always being treated as a newly graduated doctor's assistant. Sometimes, he was even tasked with observing surgical operations, standing off to the side and taking notes based on the instructions given to him by other doctors. His movements were always carefully calculated, and he avoided answering specific questions that could expose him. Although he wasn't a real doctor, Frank's life in the hospitals was thrilling. He lived in a world full of respect and admiration. He enjoyed a privileged status within the hospital, considered a medical assistant despite not doing anything that required real medical training. He became part of the system, surrounded by colleagues who took their medical careers seriously. Sometimes, he enjoyed meals at large hospitals where free meals were available to doctors. He was always treated with exceptional care, making life inside the hospital full of perks he never expected. But one time, while working at the New York hospital, an incident almost exposed him. Frank was assisting with an initial examination of a patient, and when asked to provide a diagnosis, he suddenly felt the pressure. He had no real idea how to make a medical diagnosis. He tried to handle the situation by using vague medical terms and avoiding the specific details that could reveal his ignorance. Luckily, there was another doctor watching closely, asking him to discuss the diagnosis in more detail. Frank had no choice but to defer the conversation, apologizing that he needed to review the matter further. Fortunately, the doctor didn't raise any suspicions and allowed him to walk away from the situation. As time passed, the suspicions of certain doctors and hospitals began to rise. Frank never really expected to live this way forever, but as the number of hospitals he worked at grew, medical authorities began to take notice of suspicious reports related to his forged credentials. In 1969, the FBI began to pursue Frank after a doctor he had worked with noticed discrepancies in his documents. The investigation started, which eventually led to the discovery that Frank Abagnale was never a real doctor. His pursuit began across the U.S., and the government was closing in on him more and more. From 1967 to 1969, while Frank's life was filled with success and excitement, it all came crashing down when the FBI investigation began. Although this was a relatively short chapter in Frank's life, impersonating a doctor was one of his most impressive criminal acts, showcasing his skill at manipulating the system. In the end, he was arrested and his fake medical career came to an end, marking the start of a new phase in his life, a phase where he would face justice. After years of manipulating the banking, aviation, and medical systems, where Frank had shown an incredible talent for forging documents and assuming different identities, he decided to challenge himself once again. Instead of staying on the familiar path of cons, he decided to take a bold step forward in the world of fraud, testing his ability to deceive the legal system itself. This was the point where Frank chose to push the boundaries of his past scams and infiltrate the most protected profession in society, law. At the beginning of 1969, after successfully working in other fields, Frank felt the need to shake things up in his criminal career. The perfect opportunity came in the form of law. He knew that lawyers, like doctors, were highly respected in society, with the power to make legal decisions that could affect people's lives. For Frank, the legal field represented a real challenge, and he believed there was no better place to test his skills in manipulating the system than the legal profession. It all started when Frank watched a lawyer in court and paid close attention to the way cases were handled and the prestigious position lawyers held in society. That moment sparked an idea in his mind to deceive the courts and law offices and to impersonate a professional lawyer. Frank began preparing for this phase by gathering information about the legal system. He learned everything he could about how lawyers earned their credentials and how they were admitted in the United States. Although he had never studied law or even completed a college degree, he knew that he could use his forgery skills to bypass these obstacles. He designed a forged law degree from Harvard University, one of the top law schools in the country. The documents he created were astonishing in their accuracy. The forged degrees contained detailed information about a lawyer's graduation from the university, complete with dates and official seals that made them look incredibly real. In addition, he forged fake employment papers from a law firm, showing that he had worked there as part of his legal training, which added even more credibility to his fake identity. To ensure his plan would succeed, Frank started studying basic legal terms and some rules of legal procedures. He read many books on civil and criminal law, preparing himself for any questions or legal situations that might arise while he worked. In 1969, Frank decided to test his plan in Louisiana. He knew there were many small firms and law offices that might not be thorough in vetting new lawyers. So, he walked into one of these law offices and introduced himself as a young lawyer just hired from Harvard University. It didn't take long for him to convince the office owners of his fake abilities. His forged credentials looked so flawless that they treated him like a real lawyer. Before long, he was working on real cases even though he had no legal knowledge whatsoever. He was assigned to attend court sessions and provide legal counsel to clients. Frank continued in this role, and no one suspected him at first. One of the most significant moments during this time came when Frank decided to show off his skills in court. After settling into his fake law career, he was assigned a small case at the New Orleans courthouse. He was to represent a client in a civil matter. In court, Frank acted with great confidence, moving between the tables like an experienced lawyer. He used every legal term he had studied, trying to appear as though he had years of experience. He spoke slowly and deliberately, ensuring he didn't raise any suspicions from the judge or the other lawyers. Despite having no real legal knowledge, his overconfidence made him seem like an expert lawyer. In one situation, he had to present a defense in a packed courtroom. Instead of backing down or asking for more time, Frank pushed forward, using his limited knowledge of the law to continue making his arguments. He even managed to impress the judge and the jury, convincing them he was an experienced lawyer, even though none of them knew he was clueless about most of the laws. As time went on, Frank began to feel the pressure building. The longer he stayed in this role, the higher the stakes. He started off working on civil cases and civil matters. That didn't require too many complex details. But as the trust people had in him grew, the cases he was assigned to became more complicated. He was now facing new challenges that required him to navigate more precise and difficult legal procedures. One day, he was tasked with a case that required detailed legal consultations with a seasoned judge. Frank knew that if he wasn't careful, this could be the moment that exposed him. So, he spent hours in the law office, studying court rulings and avoiding situations that could spark any doubts. But he knew the system could catch up to him at any moment. Despite the skills he showed in mimicking real lawyers, the inevitable exposure was closing in. In one case he lost. Some of his colleagues started noticing he didn't have enough knowledge for the more complex legal cases. His answers to some of their questions became confusing and inaccurate. One of the more experienced lawyers at the firm began to doubt his credibility, after a client mentioned that Frank had never traveled to another city as he had claimed. This raised even more suspicions about his background. The office started looking into Frank's past, and unofficial investigations into his history began to take shape. But before they could prove his involvement in the fraud, Frank made the decision to run once again. In the end, he left the office without being fully caught, but he knew that his time in the legal world was coming to an end. His time impersonating a lawyer wasn't long, but it marked a new peak in Frank's criminal journey. During this period, he managed to fool the courts and legal office staff long enough to experience the taste of the legal world, with all of its respect and prestige. However, this chapter of his life was about to close when investigators started closing in on him. This was another turning point for Frank, where he found himself once again forced to flee the legal system before he was discovered. After years of manipulating the banking system, aviation, medicine, and law, Frank Abagnale's life had been filled with thrilling adventures and constant evasion of the law. But after successfully impersonating so many different people and deceiving so many systems, there was no way he could escape forever. Finally, in 1969, the federal investigations took a more serious turn, and his inevitable downfall was approaching fast. In 1969, the FBI began an intense investigation into Frank Abagnale. The traces of his fraud operations were obvious, as authorities in several U.S. states had started linking his various criminal activities and connecting the dots. With detailed information about his forged identities and use of fake IDs, the FBI ramped up its surveillance to try to catch him. But despite Frank always knowing that his day would come, he had no idea how quickly the authorities would catch up to him. Despite his cleverness and ability to change his identities rapidly, things started to shift. He had made several small mistakes that wouldn't have exposed him in the past. But as the number of crimes he committed grew, those mistakes became harder to ignore. In 1969, while Frank was in France, authorities managed to pinpoint his location with near certainty. He had traveled to Europe to escape the pursuit of American authorities, hiding behind multiple false identities, trying to avoid capture. But one day, while in the French city of Marseille, local police had been monitoring some suspicious activity in the area, and during routine searches, Frank walked straight into their trap. Frank was acting normal, just like he always did, relying on his same old tactics of forgery and fraud to buy travel tickets or book hotel rooms at discounted rates. But the investigations in France were starting to piece together a mix of reports from the police about several people who had been arrested for forgery, which led them to connect these cases to one person who was moving around France using multiple identities. On June 2, 1969, Frank was arrested at the Marseille train station in the south of France. In that moment, he was calm and relaxed, traveling between European cities, convinced that the French police wouldn't be able to identify him easily. But he was caught without any resistance. This was a pivotal moment in Frank's life. Even though he knew his day would eventually come, he still thought escaping would be possible, especially in countries outside of the US. But when he was arrested in France, he was forced to face a new reality. Escaping was no longer an option. After his arrest in Marseille, Frank went through a complex legal process and was extradited to the United States in 1970. Upon arriving in the US, he was charged with multiple serious crimes related to fraud, forgery, and identity theft. To the federal government, he was one of the country's most dangerous criminals, due to his widespread deception of the system and the vast sums of money he had stolen from banks, airlines, hospitals, and law firms. His extradition to the U.S. came as a huge shock to Frank, who immediately found himself facing a trial that was described as extremely complex. The evidence against him was solid, whether it was through witness testimony, missing records, or the forged documents found in both Europe and America. After being handed over to U.S. authorities, Frank was sent to the notorious Atlanta State Penitentiary in Georgia, one of the most famous prisons in the United States. Frank, who had spent most of his life on the run, was initially unprepared for what awaited him behind bars. Life in prison was harsh, and he had to adjust to a new reality. However, Frank wasn't just any regular inmate. His charming, modern persona, along with his exceptional intelligence, caught the attention of many of the other prisoners. He began to deal with both guards and fellow inmates in a way that showed them he wasn't just an ordinary criminal, he was someone with a rare ability to influence and persuade. In one intriguing story, Frank even tried to exploit his situation in prison by organizing a network of inmates who would help him write letters to authorities outside, hoping to improve his conditions, though his efforts ultimately didn't succeed. Despite the tough circumstances in prison, Frank still tried to find a way to escape, as he had in the past. But this time, prison was different. The other inmates were watching his every move, and the guards were more cautious with him. Even though he had managed to escape from most situations before, he realized that escaping from prison wasn't as easy as it used to be. At this stage in his life, Frank began to think about changing his approach, and signs of personal transformation started to emerge. He had plenty of time to reflect on his past experiences and reevaluate his life. He began to feel some regret for the choices he made that caused him to waste years of his life on evasion and lies. He started focusing more on educating himself, learning new skills that might help him in the future, like improving his understanding of the law. He saw prison as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to change the course of his life. In 1974, after spending 5 years in prison, Frank was released after striking a deal with the government. As part of the deal, he agreed to cooperate with the federal authorities, providing them with crucial information on how other fraudsters operated and the methods they used to deceive. This deal marked a major turning point in his life, as he went from being a criminal mastermind to someone helping in government investigations. When he was released, Frank Abagnale had only served 5 years of his 12-year sentence, but prison had been a tough lesson in his life. After his release, he began working as a fraud consultant, speaking at conferences, and sharing his experiences with financial institutions and government sectors, teaching them how to avoid falling into the trap of fraud and forgery. In the end, those years in prison became the moment that paved the way for his new life, a life far from the fraud and risks he lived in the past. After spending 5 years at the Atlanta State Penitentiary, where his time was filled with reflection and analysis, Frank began to realize how much he could transform his life. In 1974, he was released under a deal with the federal government, agreeing to help the U.S. authorities in combating financial fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence. This marked the beginning of a new chapter for Frank, but the path to change wasn't without its challenges. Upon his release from prison, Frank Abagnale was no longer the young adventurer who once forged checks or impersonated others. After reflecting on his past, he became more mature and aware of the consequences of his actions. At first, he struggled to adjust to his new life, trying to turn away from his criminal past. He found himself facing a lot of hard work in order to reconcile with society, and offer advice to the institutions he had once deceived. The first step in his transformation from criminal to consultant was fulfilling the deal he had made with the government, which involved helping the U.S. authorities in their efforts to combat financial crimes. Specifically, he had to train bank officials and financial institutions on how to spot forgeries and the techniques he himself had once used to breach these systems. He spent hours offering government consultations, teaching institutions how to resist the complex fraud techniques he had once created. Frank was the first to acknowledge his genius at manipulating the financial system, sharing precise details about his methods for forging documents, such as mimicking signatures, creating fake identities, and even how he had broken into banking systems to facilitate fraud. The knowledge he provided was invaluable to the government, paving the way for him to become a recognized consultant in the field. As time passed, government agencies and private companies began to seek Frank's advice more and more. He began consulting for several firms, giving training lectures and workshops to bank employees, hospitals, and airline companies. For example, he started working with the FBI, training their agents on how to identify forgery and financial fraud crimes. He offered his consulting services based on his personal experiences, sharing the details of the operations he had used, which still posed a threat in many cases. He also began speaking at international conferences, where he was invited to discuss how to combat forgery and protect systems from the risks posed by people with high-level manipulation skills. He became one of the leading experts in the field, thanks to his personal experience, which gave him a unique perspective on how fraudsters think, making him more capable of offering effective solutions. Frank's psychological transformation was crucial. After years of living in deception and manipulation, he found himself facing the mirror of his criminal past. His prison experience was a turning point, where he started to feel regret for the years he wasted chasing money and power at the expense of his personal dignity and freedom. But instead of wallowing in guilt, he chose to rebuild his life positively. Frank also started working on improving his personal relationships. After losing touch with his family during his years in prison, he began to rebuild those connections. His mother and father were part of this process, showing a willingness to support him during this transformation phase, and they became part of the process of rebuilding his self-confidence. One of the most significant events during this time was the writing of his autobiography, Catch Me If You Can, which was first published in 1980. The book served as a documentation of his personal experience in the world of fraud, focusing on many of the adventures he had from impersonating a pilot to stealing money from banks. His book wasn't just an autobiography. It also served as a warning to individuals and institutions on how to recognize fraud and how to prevent it. The book was a huge success, and it wasn't just a retelling of Frank's experiences, it also provided practical lessons on forgery and fraud. The book, full of valuable lessons, captured the public's attention, highlighting Frank's extraordinary intelligence and his ability to understand and manipulate systems, giving him a new reputation away from his criminal past. After the success of his autobiography, Frank began being invited to appear on television shows and media interviews. He shared stories from his past life, but he always made sure to point out the drastic change that had occurred within him. The goal of these appearances was to give the public real-world experience on how to avoid falling victim to fraud, using modern techniques and a deep understanding of the mindset of fraudsters. In 2002, his book was turned into a major film, Catch Me If You Can, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. The movie was a huge success and drew attention to his captivating story. It also helped elevate his role as a fraud prevention consultant and made his story even more famous worldwide. In addition to working with the FBI, Frank provided consulting services to major financial institutions, such as banks and government agencies. He helped these organizations strengthen their security systems against fraud and led workshops to train employees on handling financial crimes. He had an exceptional ability to identify security gaps in financial systems and provided practical solutions to help institutions reduce risks. One of the most significant moments in his work came when he collaborated with the U.S. Treasury to develop new techniques for identifying counterfeit currency. This was a golden opportunity for Frank to prove his ability to turn his past knowledge of forgery into a useful skill to help protect the financial system. From a stealthy criminal to a trusted consultant, Frank Abagnale's life saw a dramatic transformation. Thanks to his personal experience in the world of fraud, he became a recognized expert in combating fraud. His ability to manipulate the system was considered one of a kind. But once he decided to use that expertise to help others, his role in society became more important than ever. His transformation wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a shift in society's perspective on how to confront fraud and protect financial systems. After more than 4 decades of transforming from a desperate criminal to a trusted consultant, Frank Abagnale became one of the leading experts in fraud prevention. Today, his life reflects a long journey filled with challenges and drastic changes that shaped his path. From a mastermind of complex fraud schemes in his youth to working alongside major government and banking institutions around the world to combat financial crime, his life now serves as a model for profound change. Since the release of his book Catch Me If You Can in 1980, Frank's life has been forever altered. The book wasn't just a recounting of his adventures. It was also an expression of his internal transformation from a convicted criminal to someone who contributes positively to society. This journey wasn't simple, as it took tremendous effort for Frank to cleanse himself of his past and prove that he could use his knowledge of fraud in a constructive way. The book brought him unprecedented fame. He quickly became a familiar face in the media, being invited to appear on major TV shows like The Tonight Show and 60 Minutes to openly share his story. These media appearances were not only a way to build his confidence, but also to demonstrate how he had turned his past into a resource for the benefit of society. Speaking on topics like protecting banks from fraud, fighting check fraud, and cybersecurity. In 2002, Catch Me If You Can was adapted into a successful film directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Tom Hanks. The film was a captivating retelling of Frank's life, earning him even greater global fame. While the movie was packed with excitement and drama, it also served as a testament to the transformation Frank had undergone. The film's success didn't just boost Frank's public reputation. It opened even more doors for him to work as a consultant for international institutions, paving the way for him to continue his work. In the field, he had become an expert in fraud prevention. The film gave him an extra boost, allowing him to appear at academic and media events worldwide, where he offered workshops on how to identify financial risks and spoke about building security systems to combat fraud. Today, Frank Abagnale is one of the world's top consultants in fraud prevention. His expertise extends beyond financial institutions to include governments and international security organizations. He's worked with the FBI, the European Central Bank, and cybersecurity agencies in numerous countries worldwide. His fraud prevention strategies focus on techniques like improving digital security systems, tackling email fraud, and using AI to detect suspicious patterns. Frank doesn't just offer consulting services. He's also an active participant in training programs aimed at teaching financial sector professionals how to verify identities. He educates employees on recognizing advanced fraud techniques, such as digital document forgery or complex financial breaches targeting banks and major corporations. For example, he trained employees at the European Central Bank on how to protect credit card systems from electronic fraud and helped the FBI update their fraud prevention programs using modern technologies like big data analysis to spot suspicious activities. On a personal level, Frank has built a stable new life far from his dark past. After years of seeking forgiveness and repentance for his criminal history, he began to rebuild stronger relationships with his parents and family. Although his children never knew him as a criminal, they were raised in a stable educational environment where Frank focused on teaching them the values he learned during his tough years. Frank Abagnale is also active in community service, participating in awareness campaigns to fight financial crimes. He views his current life as a form of practical redemption, trying to make up for the harm he caused in the past. He's begun participating in educational programs for children, teaching them how to protect themselves from falling into the traps of fraud and forgery. One of the biggest shifts in Frank's life today is his focus on cybersecurity, which has become a core aspect of his consulting work. With the growing reliance on the internet and technology, Frank started collaborating with major tech companies and governments to strengthen digital security. He's become known as a person contributing to the development of effective systems for detecting digital fraud. His role in cybersecurity has been crucial. He's been consulted by top IT companies on how to protect their data and operations against breaches. He played a key role in developing fraud detection programs using AI algorithms, a technology now widely used in banks and financial institutions to identify suspicious activities in real time. Since the early 2000s, Frank Abagnale has become an active member of many international conferences and seminars focused on fraud prevention and protecting the financial system. His participation wasn't just about giving lectures. He actively interacted with professionals from all over the world, sharing his experiences and his approach to handling complex financial crises. One of the most notable events was the International Fraud Conference held in London in 2010, where Frank was one of the main speakers. At the conference, he gave an in-depth look at how fraud techniques have evolved over time and led workshops on building a strong security culture within financial institutions. Today, Frank Abagnale is more than just a fraud prevention consultant. He's a symbol of personal transformation. Thanks to his incredible journey from a master con artist to a respected financial security expert, he has become a prominent figure in the fight against financial crimes. His story continues to inspire countless individuals who want to change their lives, while also showing us how someone can completely alter their destiny by choosing to rebuild their life in a sincere and community-positive way. Today, Frank Abagnale isn't just a trusted fraud consultant. He's also an author, speaker, and a successful father who consistently demonstrates how the simplest lessons in life can transform a person's fate. And with all that Frank has achieved, from being one of the most infamous con men to a leading expert in fraud prevention, his story is far from over. His transformation is proof that no matter where you start, you can always rewrite your story. But this is just the beginning. The journey of reinvention and redemption continues. And Frank's story is a testament to how one man can change his fate and make an impact on the world. But hold on, this isn't the last adventure you'll hear. Stay tuned, because the next story we have for you features a character even more powerful and complex than Frank Abagnale. You won't want to miss it. Make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and like the video if you're excited for what's coming next. The adventure continues, don't blink or you might miss it.